Okay. All right, welcome everyone. We'll give people a few more seconds to come into the room. Those of you who are coming in, and if you're already in, if you can place yourselves on mute, that will be wonderful.
2060.
I think someone had a television on. All right, we'll give folks a few more seconds. We're so glad to have you here with us in our second session of the Seed Conference, and we hope you are enjoying the conference so far. Okay. So welcome everyone. If you were in the last session, welcome back. If this is your first session, welcome. We are so happy to have you with us tonight, and that you've chosen to join us for the 6 p.m. session, which is Holistic Botany, which will be moderated by Ken Greene, and Hannah Traggis will be assisting. This workshop or this session is part of the 2021 Northeast Organic Seed Conference. And I want to let everyone know that this session is being recorded. So just be mindful of that. And if you have any issues with recording, feel free to keep your camera off.
We are good in terms of the.
My name is Anna Muhammad, and I live in Springfield, Massachusetts. I am with NOFA Mass. I garden in what they would call Pecumtuck Nation, which is Springfield. I am the Equity Director and Food Access Coordinator for NOFA Mass, and I work with community gardens in the Springfield area and with youth leaders. So it's definitely a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. I will be helping out as the tech host and working with some of the things in the background, almost like a Wizard of Oz. So if you have any issues or anything that comes up, feel free to use the chat and I will assist you as best I can. Now, if we were in another time pre-COVID, we would have come in from either a long drive, a long flight, or a long train ride. And after being a little tired, a little sleepy, we would have come together, basically given hugs to those we hadn't seen in a while, as well as handshakes to people we have just met. And so in this age of COVID, we are trying to duplicate this same feeling with our sessions. Before we move on, I just have a few things to go over, a few housekeeping things. Now, if you're seeing my screen, you're looking at our community agreements. You will see this in all of our sessions. Please take time to look at it in your socio program book as you go through the 8 days of our conference, but also take a look at it now on the screen. I am not going to go over all of it. I am just going to pull a few key notes for your consideration. One mic. So it's one voice at a time. You entered this room in the mute situation. Keep your mics on mute until you're ready to give a question, until we enter that time when we're taking questions from the audience. Feel free to use the chat for any of your questions. Avoid any jargon, and that could be acronyms, that could be all kinds of abbreviations. I said NOFA Mass, that's the Northeast Organic Farming Association, Massachusetts chapter, but please explain any jargon that comes up. And lastly, we are in this time of technology, so please be patient. Things will happen. We were trying to iron out as much as we can, but sometimes technology is not always our friend. So as we are working through this new medium of Zoom, just be patient with one another, be patient with us and the presenters. Just as a tip to increase the bandwidth for our presenters tonight, we're asking if you're not presenting, if you wouldn't mind keeping your cameras off, and definitely keep yourselves muted. That way we can increase the bandwidth. The next slide I'm going to show you is a land acknowledgement. So we know that we are all on land that was inhabited by our indigenous family. And so we've provided you a website, a link here that will show you, if you put in your location, your state, it'll tell you the indigenous family that was there before European colonization. We'd like you to take that time during the conference to look that up. But before we move on, let's take a little time, a moment of silence, of prayer, of mindfulness, in gratitude and also in honor of our indigenous community in the lands that we all now inhabit. Thank you so much for taking those few seconds. Again, please use that website so you can see the land that you now are living on and living with. We are also joined during our conference by the In Living Color virtual BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color space that's being facilitated by Amanda David and Mandana Boucher of In Living Color. They have graciously have been working with us during the conference. Their opening ceremony was this morning, but you can use the email that you see here to request entry to the other sessions that they will hold throughout the conference. And I do really suggest that you utilize them at any time. And if any time they can be of service, please feel free to reach out to them. This week, we have some wonderful keynote addresses that will take place during the conference. I heard Laura Lindnick speak earlier. It was a very wonderful keynote. We will be hearing from Banu tonight, but Banu will also be doing the keynote on Thursday, and also from Brian Caldwell on January 23rd. I do encourage everyone to check out the keynote address during the week, and it should be very impactful for everyone. We will have UVM note takers in all of our sessions. And what I'd like to do, if the UVM note takers can identify themselves, if they're in this session, they can use the chat to type in their names, where they're from, and that they will be note taking in this session. Part of their work will be with the Needs Assessment Day. They'll be there as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But as part of a needs assessment, notes will center on current and future priorities, opportunities, and challenges. Notes will not include any personal or identifiable information. This information will be compiled into a narrative in the coming months, open to the public for comments and feedback from the Northeast Sea community. And that session will take place on January 24th. We really encourage you to attend that. And as I'm starting to talk about that session, you see the schedule for January 24th in the morning, mid-afternoon, and late afternoon. You can join for a day dedicated to supporting the Northeast Organic Seed System and all its diverse participants in collaboration with conference planners and the University of Vermont. And so we will put the link there for you so you can register for that. It is a free event, and we do encourage everyone to attend that. And as I'm wrapping up my remarks, we do know that this conference, oftentimes many cannot attend. We hope some have benefited from the OREI grant supported scholarships, the SEED conference, and our UVM collaborators have been able to offer. And we are so happy to offer a selection of these free access SEED workshops and meetups. We will put in a chat the link where you can sign up for these. Please do so. They look like they're going to be very wonderful events. And you can also use that same link to register for the Conference Need Assessment Day. So you can do all that at one link. So with no more from myself, I now turn our session over to Ken Greene. He will be one of the moderators for this session tonight. And Ken, I'll stop sharing my screen and feel free to take it away.
So weird as the meetings you see inside everyone's home.
Yeah.
Welcome everyone. Just a reminder, if you haven't muted yourself, please do that so we don't wind up interrupting our different presenters. This is the Holistic Botany session. I am so excited about the folks who are involved in this and really heartened to see so many people joining us for this conversation. And so I just want to start by letting everyone introduce themselves. So Banu, if you'd like to start.
Hi, I'm Banu Subramaniam from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I am currently speaking from Arlington, Massachusetts, which is on the land of the Algonquin people. And I'm really excited to be here. And thanks everyone for coming.
Hannah?
Hi, everybody. My name is Hannah Traggis. I am speaking to you tonight from Cape Cod, which is on the land of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. I come from a number of backgrounds, namely Aurelia's Garden and the Freed Seed Federation.
Zahn?
Hello, everyone. My name is Zahn Chacko. I am a postdoctoral fellow in the Women and Gender Studies department at Wellesley College, which is situated on the unceded lands of the Nipmuc and Wapano. Thank you so much for having me here, and welcome to any First Nations people who are here with us today. I come from a farming community in southern India, where my family has grown rice, coconut, and banana for the last 3 generations. I'm really happy to be around so many other plant people today. Thank you for the invitation.
And I'm Kay Greene. Some of you know me from Hudson Valley Seed Company. I also am the director of a nonprofit organization called Seedshed, which focuses on seed justice. So I want to hop right in and start by sharing some of the overarching themes that we're going to be focusing on today and a little bit of the intention around this. Just so everyone knows, we will be having a few moments where we're each presenting different things. We'll have some conversations between the panelists. There'll also be a breakout session, and there should be hopefully time at the end for more sharing with everyone who's joined us today. So part of the theme today is this idea of approaching botany from perspective of winnowing. We're not here to say botany bad, this good. In fact, that would be pretty binary of us, and that's something that we're trying to actually address. So we have some framing questions. What concepts and language from botany are helpful for understanding seeds and seed saving? And what concepts and language from botany limit our understanding of seeds and seed saving? And because botany is about human interaction with plants and human relationship with plants, we're also have an overarching question of what is the human role in seed saving or in plant relationships. So we're going to start with looking at a few of these bigger concepts with the question, what is botany?
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I want to spend a few minutes just presenting what I know and my experiences with botany. I was raised by a horticulturist. My mother was a botanist. So I have lived and thought about living with plants all my life. Textbook-wise, botany is simply the study of plants. And this study and fascination with plants is as old as human-plant relationships, tens of thousands of years old. And as old as written language is, we can find written accounts of people's studies of plants. And all of those fit into this concept of what is botany. But we want an understanding of where our concept of botany comes from today. This concept of modern academic botany. And the screen is not advancing. There we go. Sorry. So today, a trained botanist, if you've gone to college to become a botanist, you learn how to take things apart and how to study the individual pieces, with this idea that by understanding things that have been stripped into pieces, we can put those pieces of a puzzle back together with a greater understanding. We dissect plants, and once we do that, we look as closely as we can. And if we can't see very well, we use magnifying glasses, and we use microscopes, and we begin documenting what it is that we see. The idea of modern academic botany comes from this idea of classifying everything we see around us, of cataloging, of naming things, of collecting and amassing information. And using all sorts of words. Our language that an academically trained botanist uses is full of terminology that is often difficult to even pronounce. We spend years trying to make it through the books that we are assigned to read from our freshman year through our graduate studies and all of our interests. And let's talk a little bit about the development of this concept of this modern academic botany. As the world came out of the Dark Ages into this period of enlightenment during the Renaissance, there was a return towards the Greek and Roman way of thinking, of approaching things systematically, and scientifically. And in the 18th century, those who had the privilege and the wealth to study, the scholarly people, they began looking at plants. They began looking at the natural world around them. Certain inventions that came out of the industrial age, such as microscopes, helped us look even closer. And this idea of humanism, that we have a human-centric world, was very prevalent throughout the Renaissance. And all of those ideas, this would just come out of the Dark Ages and the Crusades, and people finding every right and taking every right that they could to explore the world, to conquer the world, to collect everywhere they went. And that whole framework was just the dominant mindset throughout Europe, as the sciences in general and botany in specific came to be. Oftentimes, botany was actually considered one of the pursuits that was suitable for women, although they were often not credited with the work that they did. But most of the scientific illustrations that you see in historic botanical texts were actually done by women. And as I said, they were often not credited for their work. today, the concept and the question of what is botany is changing, and it should change. Botany, as any other body of work or vocation, should be a sum of its parts. And for a long time, the modern academic botany has disregarded many parts that don't fit that humanist paradigm. And so today we are talking about a more holistic approach to botany. And with anything, our ideologies, our philosophies, our mindset are often linked very tightly to the language that we use to express those ideas. And so we're hoping to dive deeper, to bring more parts and more voices, more languages, more people, more thoughts, and more concepts, and hope that modern academic botany changes into a holistic and inclusive body of work where all humans that are just simply fascinated and in love with plants and just want to work with plants and know more about them can work together comfortably, can work together in a way where we can communicate better with each other. And I think I am going to let Zan take the stage.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
I hope so. Great.
Yeah.
Before we can start understanding what it means to decolonize botany, we need to appreciate what makes botany colonial in the first place. I use a cheeky subtitle in this section, in other words, who put the potato in my curry, as a humorous invitation to consider the myriad ways by which many aspects of history, culture, including what foods we eat, what clothes we wear, the materials that allow us to move around the world, like the rubber in our tires, how all of these are derived from plants that were from other places at some point, but now are part of our lives. But then how also did this movement of plants participate in the world that we have come to inherit? The answer, I would argue, is due to colonial botany. What we understand when we study the history of botany is that colonial explorations were the foundation around which the field flourished. Projects to study, name, acclimatize, cultivate, popularize, and market plants in Europe owed their existence to voyages of discovery, technologies of transport and propagation, and the budding natural sciences. We heard a little bit about this from Hannah. Studies have shown that the financial and cultural successes of the colonial enterprise were dependent on the successful acclimatization and proliferation of profitable plants. The need for botanical diversity for the purposes of breeding and for use in agriculture points to the importance of continued exploration and material transfer. As new specimens were being brought in from collectors who were being sent around the world, new means of making knowledge emerged to cope, categorize, and order the specimens that they were bringing with them. In other words, to take the specimens and turn them into facts. And those herbaria specimens that Hannah showed us are exactly the tools that allow scientists who call themselves botanists to do that. So new technologies of transport, like the Wardian case, were developed to bring plants from around the world to their new homes. New techniques of illustration and drawing emerged with the need for making quick studies in hostile fields. What you have on the screen in front of you is one of the oldest collections of plants and seeds, the Kew Gardens, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. It is a strange attractor around which all botanical knowledge in the last 250 years has revolved. Since its founding in 1759, Kew has been a central node in moving, transplanting, saving, and creating botanical knowledge. While sending envoys around the world to collect botanical specimens, Kew maintained authority and control over the naming and the control over where the plants that they collected would be sent. So the histories of tea, cotton, rubber, potatoes, there's the potato I was referencing, and orchids are all part of the sort of Kew network of moving plants around the world for economy. But I'd like to use another example, an example from Kew of one of its early directors, Joseph Dalton Hooker, who in between 1848 and 1849 was one of the first Europeans who visited the area of Sikkim, which is now in northeastern India. He was a plant hunter and the son of Kew's first director, William Jackson Hooker. And he was there in the Himalayas to hunt for treasure, plant treasure that is, to send back to his father at Kew. Writing from the Himalayas, Hooker said, I quote, "The splendor of the rhododendrons is marvelous. There are 10 kinds on this hill: scarlet, white, lilac, yellow, pink, maroon. The cliffs actually bloom with them." End quote. It was tough going to scale the tortuous mountainsides in the Himalayas to search for these botanical novelties. At least they were new to him. He also wrote in a letter, quote, "I stand at 13,000 feet, very much on purpose, to collect their seeds of rhododendrons. With cold fingers, it is not easy. Botanizing during the march is difficult. Sometimes the jungle is so dense, you have enough to do to keep hat and spectacles in company, or it is precipitous. Certainly one often progresses spread eagle fashion against the cliff for some distance and crosses narrow planks over profound abysses with no handhold whatsoever," end quote. These letters from Hooker make him sound exactly like the explorer, hunter, that you imagine and think of when you think of romantic novels of exploring unknown territories. Now, Hooker was successful in finding and extracting scores of specimens, 25 different species of rhododendron, which he dutifully sent back to his father at Kew. These were assimilated and propagated into the gardens, and the one that you see on the screen, Rhododendron Edgeworthy, was one of the species said to have been, quote, "discovered by Hooker." This illustration is from a spectacular book, Rhododendrons of Sikkim Himalaya, which was published very soon after his return from India. And this variety is still grown at Kew today. But let's pass out this historical moment for a few seconds. Hooker would not have been able to make these collections or even know where to go without scores of helpers, porters, traditional knowledge owners in the area where he was collecting. When he eventually became the director of Kew, Hooker maintained relationships with some of these interlocutors, but like the women in botany that Hannah mentioned, they were rarely credited and their indigenous knowledge was either co-opted or forgotten. When Hooker, quote unquote, discovered these 25 hitherto unknown species, he was given the priority to name them, as if to suggest that these plants didn't have local names or were unknown to the people who shared a home with them for millennia. At Kew, the rhododendrons sent by Hooker have been cultivated and used to invigorate the rhododendron dell. On the Kew website, if you go, you can search and you can see them. And in the marketing material of Kew today, they say, quote, "If you visit Kew today, you can see some of Hooker's species of Sikkim rhododendrons," Hooker species, he owns them apparently, "putting on one of the garden's most colorful spring displays. In fact," I quote, "they are looking spectacular right now, and it's well worth making the trip to Kew during May to see them. After all, it is much easier than going all the way to Sikkim, end quote. This, in a nutshell, is what the colonial enterprise was all about, to bring the world to London. And this was happening in Paris and in other colonial metropoles. But it went much further. As early as 1850, even before Hooker was even back from India, his father had sent seeds from the rhododendrons that he had sent to other colonial botanists and administrators across the British Empire. Rhododendrons from Sikkim to Ireland, potatoes from Lima to Bombay, jacaranda from South America to Brisbane in Australia, and mangoes from India to Brazil. The colonial network of flows created the plant worlds of modernity. We are because plants were extracted. Kew was also instrumental in the proliferation of botanical gardens. From less than 50 in 1901, from less than 50 to 441 by 1901, where they funded and trained and administered control over botanical futures. So converting what were once indigenous lands growing a plethora of different species to plants that were transported through the Kew network for colonial profit is at the heart of what has shaped the agricultural landscapes of the world. So why, if now it could be asked, it could be argued that colonialism is over, that we have decolonized, that we have in a post-colonial world, that the new world that we're in has ousted the colonial powers and each country has its own self-determination to choose as it will. But I would argue that we need to continue to and others in this panel would agree, that we need to continue to hold on to decolonization as a hope because it is by no means already achieved. Let me answer this question with an example from my own research using material that I've been following for the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, Kew has rebranded to pivot its position from being a colonial powerhouse of control to one of controlling the biodiverse future of the world. So looking at the quotes on the screen that are all from newspaper articles in the last 5 years or so, Kew has changed its tune to being the safeguarding home of the plants of the world. And they do this by freezing the seeds of the plants in their new shiny enterprise, the Millennium Seed Bank. I've had the luxury to spend months at the Millennium Seed Bank working as a seed curator. Now, a seed bank is, many of you I'm sure will be familiar, a place where seeds are stored at a low temperature so that their viability is kept a little bit longer than if they were kept under sort of normal conditions. Whether in the Arctics or the tropics, the basic elements of seed banks are the same. While the exact temperatures may vary, most seed banks are cold rooms with shelves of neatly labeled seed packets held in a container. These seeds come from all over the world. And the rhetorics that are used to keep seeds coming into the seed bank recapitulate some of the colonial ones that we had seen, but also do them in very interesting and slightly, I would consider, nefarious ways. I was going to talk a little bit about this, but we'll come back to it if you're interested. The relationship between seed bank locations, in this case in England, and the parts of the world from which seeds are collected renews paternalistic colonial relations. Colonialism hasn't gone away. This asymmetry is legitimized by naturalizing the split between the so-called biodiversity-rich developing world that is purportedly underfunded and ill-equipped to care for their seeds, and the biodiversity-poor but industrialized nations that have the prerequisite wealth and infrastructure to act as caretakers. Feminist scholar Michelle Murphy reminds us that the colonial relations that were never went away, and helps me see how concepts like biodiversity and ecosystem services serve as foils for continuing projects of extraction and alienation. While colonial legacies of extraction supplied a substantial portion of the currently banked seeds, nowadays seed collecting is a political act shaped by the ever-changing swirl of regulations and flows that constrict the flow of plants across international borders. But seed banks are able to circumvent that by appealing to the future of humanity as a kind of all-encompassing and important moral duty for plants to be moved. So we don't call it bioprospecting or extraction or exploitation anymore, because they are being saved for the future of all of us. But how those flows are going to be reversed, how the seeds that are banked will make their way back into the homes from where they were once taken, is not clearly articulated. And that's where and why we need to stay with decolonizing. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Banu to give us another example of a decolonizing mode.
So good evening, everyone. So part of what the way we've organized this session is, Hannah began with reminding us with an overview of the botany all of us studied in school. Zan has introduced the immense implications of the history of colonialism, not only for what it did to humans, but what it did to plant and animal life, across the world. And so part of what I'm going to try to do is to take that question up of what tools feminist, indigenous, and post-colonial botany teaches us. And there are a lot of tools, which is too much for this short session, but just beginning to think of how we might reckon with that history, and how might we start beginning to think about this question of decolonization. No doubt decolonization is too immense a project. Colonialism is in every pore of modern science, but it seems important for us to begin to start thinking about the frameworks of the field and how we might begin questioning the terms and frameworks of the field. And one of the central points that come up in feminism, indigenous post-colonial botany, is the question of binaries. And one of the arguments historians make is that binary thinking is one of the cornerstones of Judeo-Christian philosophy. And so if you think right from the archetypal virgin whore, the sacred and the profane, binaries pervade scientific thought, pervade our cultural understandings in the West. So for example, of male and female, of masculine and feminine, of homosexual and heterosexual, of white and black, low culture, high culture, and we can go on. So binaries are very, very important. And one of the things that is really important is to open it up, to think beyond two and what that might allow us to do. But I just wanted to open up to an audience question of how many binaries this audience can name in botany. So just unmute yourself and shout it out.
Male and female.
What was that?
Male and female.
Male and female, yes.
Monocot and dicot.
Monocot, dicot.
Old world and new world.
Old world, new world, yeah.
Ornamental,
Native.
edible,
Mm-hmm.
Native or invasive.
Mm-hmm.
sexual or asexual reproduction,
Uh-huh.
Sulfur or outcrosser.
Mm-hmm.
Monoecious, dioecious.
Mm-hmm.
Fruit or vegetable.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Annual, perennial.
Uh-huh.
Legal or illegal.
Uh-huh.
Orthodox, recalcitrant.
Mm-hmm.
Evergreen, deciduous.
Mm-hmm.
Western and Oriental.
Uh-huh.
Cultivated or wild,
Mm-hmm.
Perfect and imperfect.
Mm-hmm.
Valuable or useless.
Mhm. Madeline, do you want to go? You had your hands up. Madeline, Therese, if you want to speak, please do. I see your hand up there. Okay, I think this was excellent set, and I'm sure if we took a little more time, we could come up with many more. And part of the point is that these binary frameworks force us to take a plant world that is really immensely diverse in its various adaptations, in the levels of variation that it finds. And then what we do in the field of botany is force them into these two boxes. So for example, and you've named most of these, of male and female, and we do the male and female. We can have male and female trees, male and female plants, male and female flowers. And if there are male and female flowers, we will name them in parts of male and female, especially with flowering plants. Native and alien, which is a point many of you make. Also very fundamentally, this idea of nature and culture, which is again a very foundationally important idea of where we put humans. So very often in conservation biology, people put humans in culture. So nature gets named to be something that is outside of culture, and therefore humans are not part of it, which becomes a very problematic way in which to think about humans' roles, and especially with other cultural understandings where humans are very much part of nature and have very different relationships rather than an exploitative or one that we have seen in Western colonialism, of sexual, asexual, again, of sex and gender. And I hope what you will notice is that these are often terminology that work within human societies. So some of these are really anthropomorphic ways in which, and androcentric ways in which we read the natural world to mimic mostly Victorian Western mores, sexualities, class structures, genders. Linnaeus famously again came up with a binomial nomenclature in how we name plants. We can think in terms of genotype and phenotype, again, a separation of germplasm from somatoplasm. And many of these ideas have really been challenged with respect to modern botany and modern genetics. So for example, since we are living in COVID times, we know how important bacteria and viruses are as they allow for lateral transmission of genetic material. So when we are thinking about evolution and transmission of characters, we now know it's not only vertical sexual reproduction, but also horizontal and lateral gene transfer through vectors like bacteria and viruses. Perfect, imperfect plants, germplasm, somatoplasm, Western, Eastern, colonized, first world, third world, pure, impure. And I think you came up with a much larger list than that. So I just want to take two examples in thinking about it. One, for example, in thinking about the sexual system. And as all of you named, male and female is one of the grounding ideas that we teach in intro botany, at lots of different levels. And this was not always true, even in the West. And in part, thinking about plants within Victorian sexuality and within Western mores of sexual arrangement is something we owe to Linnaeus, who really developed his whole sexual system on the idea of the marriage of plants, of the nuptiae plantarum. And he had a sense of complete analogy. So the idea of what flowers did in sexual reproduction is, for example, that flowers spread as nuptial beds for a verdant groom and his cherished bride, right? So the whole idea of organizing, classifying plants by whether they had one anther, two anther, one pistil, two pistil was all, of one husband, two wives, two husbands, one wife. So it was all about the male and female parts of flowers. And so if you do any basic reproductive botany, all the terminology is about husbands and wives, right? So we have completely, the so-called Latin words that we use are entirely recreating a human ideas of marriage filled with husbands and wives. And of course, as a result, the ways in which we talk about what plants do, what they're capable of, are very constrained by this kind of imagination. And so one of the arguments is if we stop looking at plants through the human eye and a Western human eye with heterosexual marriages with one man and one woman, we might create a very different kind of reproductive biology that's not constrained by this mathematics of two. The second example I wanted to throw out was the idea of native and alien plants. So part of what I'm doing is just suggesting ideas that I hope we can pick up in our discussions. And again, this was something all of you noted about native and alien plants. And this, again, when you look at history, it's not that people always recognized the geography of plants the ways and we did today. And this you can, people have tracked to a particular point in British colonialism, where they were trying to create this idea of the true British flora. And as a result, you see the introduction, the idea of nature in place and nature out of place. And historians of botany like Crosby and Grove have shown that if you actually were going to talk about what colonialism did, we really need to understand colonialism as an ecological enterprise, as ecological imperialism. The point was to take materials and resources from colonial countries back into colonized lands, and transfer wealth and resources that way. And so if we think about botany, colonialism is central to the ecology of the planet as we understand it today. And so interestingly, we see this idea of native alien, and nature in place and out of place emerging during British colonial times. And some of the work I do is looking at how we talk about human migration and how we talk about plant and animal migration. And they track so amazingly together. So part of what we see is that when we have a moment of xenophobia in a country, like the moment we are living in the United States right now, the way we talk about foreign humans as undesirable transfers across species to how we talk about foreign plants. So that foreign plants like humans are seen as unhygienic, disease-ridden, causing damage and threat. They're seen as aliens and looking visibly foreign. They're taking over everything. They're doing this silently, but very, very quickly. They're seen as indestructible. The classic third world oversexed female and worries about miscegenation, that they're causing irreversible change. So we need to close the borders now to plants and foreign humans. They cause a lot of economic and ecological destruction. And ultimately they're here and they're not welcome, that they come through stealthy ways. And so the question, I particularly want, since we did the land acknowledgements, I really want to emphasize how important it is for us to move beyond, take that land acknowledgement seriously. Because part of what is amazing to me when we talk about native plants in the United States is the native plants are the white settlers, right? Sorry, not the native plants, the natives are the white settlers. So again, native is a very political category of who we acknowledge as the true natives of a particular land, rather than who were here first. And so we need to understand these categories within these kinds of political histories. And so the question becomes, if we understand that these categories in botany that we were taught come from these histories and should be understood as political, what might some of the ways be that we move beyond that? And so I want to just give you three quick ideas. One is, rather than understand the world as natural and cultural, so plants are in one world, humans are in one world, that we really understand that our past, our present, and futures are forever entangled. So rather than thinking of nature and culture, we should understand the world as nature cultures, as one word. So race is a nature culture. There's nothing like race. Race is something we have produced, but now it has particular biological meaning and resides in our bodies in very unequal ways. So it is biological and cultural. Similarly, native and alien. These are, again, political categories of who is considered native in the United States and who is not, comes from that political history. So all the botanical terms that we learn and that we use so effortlessly, it would behoove us to think about, where did these ideas come from? What do they mean? How are we defining them? Similarly, the idea of desexualizing plants. So rather than transferring human categories of reproduction onto plants and organizing this incredible plant world in this binary category of removing, of desexualizing plants to understand plant reproduction as the product of doing something different than husbands and wives and families, right? And thirdly, of moving vocabularies beyond geography, so that native and foreign are two simplistic categories for what has happened in the world through histories of colonialism, through histories of settler colonialism, United States, through the histories of slavery. And that we need to find different kinds of vocabulary that allow us to both acknowledge these colonial histories, these histories of slavery, these histories of conquest, but at the same time, allow other kinds of imaginations to take hold. So I will stop there and turn it over to Kay.
All right, so I'm going to ask Banu and Zan and Hannah to put your videos on. This is a discussion part we're going to have without slides. Wow, so much in such a short amount of time. Thank you for figuring out how to pack so much of your experience and research and knowledge into 10-minute sound bites. I know that's not easy. What we're going to do is we're going to take a few minutes to allow the presenters to either share things that came up for them that they felt like we needed to add, or ask questions of some of the other presenters. This is our kind of theory part of this session, and we're going to move from here into our breakout sessions. And after our breakout sessions, we're going to get into the practice part, which is really applying a lot of what we're talking about in this first half to actually having relationships with plants and what that can really look like in the field, and particularly with seed saving. So I just wanted to start by reflecting some of what I was seeing in the chat while you all were speaking, which is sort of this feeling of like mind blownness from people who are listening in, who, so many of us are so trained to accept this idea of scientific truth with the way that we've been trained to view plants and interact with plants. And so questioning these things is new for some people in this room, and is new for a lot of people, really, because they're just assumed to be the truth. And what I'm hearing from what you're sharing, and I think is important to name here, is that there's really no such thing as a scientific truth in that way, because we can almost always trace back that concept or that language to a particular person or people who existed at a specific point in time within a specific culture and were interpreting the world through their experience of time and culture. And that those things don't hold true forever. We're not stuck in time. They continue to change. But there are things that people get really attached to, right? And they're like, but that's the truth. And then we're 100 years later, or 200 years later, or 300 years later, and we're holding on to these things. And so that's just, I just wanted to, didn't know if the folks who were talking had a chance to see some of what was happening in chat. So I just wanted to let you know that some people are probably like, yeah, heard this, been there, living it. And other people here are like, what? This is so new for me to, so I want to thank the folks who are here that this is new for keeping an open mind and allowing this to permeate a little bit. And so I want to open it up now to Zan and Banu and Hannah, if there's anything you wanted to add or something that you were hearing from one of the other presenters that you wanted to talk about.
I just wanted to respond to Bree in the chat, in that I don't know if plants have sex. I don't want to assume plants have sex, because to me, sex has a particular history and where it comes from, of what is perverse sex, what is normal sex, what is natural sex, right? And so I sort of feel I don't want to put onto plants this idea of promiscuity and perversity and normal and normative sex. And perhaps if we weren't bound to this binary sex of humans, we might come up with very different vocabularies, because plants do very different things than humans do. And I feel we're constantly being constrained, by the frameworks of Linnaeus, who we have inherited and that we have stuck with for so long and so doggedly. And so for every normative term with plants, we have to come up with, dozens of exceptions to the rules. That often there are far more exceptions to the rules in plants than rules. And that should teach us something about why these rules are not more widespread.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, we are going to get a little bit more into that in the second half, and we're going to dream into some other ways that we could start to talk about how plants make seeds and continue their species generation to generation.
And can I just add one more thing to Bree, is that honestly, I feel what we are talking about today, that there are no experts. We are all trying to break these rules. So this wasn't meant, to contradict, but more to engage you, and in the hope that we can think together and that our collective imaginations will take us to a different place than any of our individual imaginations. So I'm just trying to be provocative here. So I wasn't trying to, contradict or disagree, but to rather think with you.
But I think both of what you were saying, Banu and Kay, is they sort of like lead into each other. So your this sort of bewilderment with the idea that science is not fixed, or that science is mutable, is a part of recognizing that what it means to be objective, this value that is, so valorized in science, is in fact something that is created in the moment, right? And so what it means to be objective today may not necessarily hold true 100 years from now. And we've seen this because the science on certain things has changed, while the science on some other things, like for instance, systematics, seems to just keep coming up with more exceptions. And so, like people within the history of science, we have this concept of a scientific revolution, right? So at some point, people thought that the Earth was the center of the solar system, and then we had this switch, this paradigm shift, and now we all agree that it is the sun. Maybe some people don't, but We do, or we all agree that the earth is a sphere. Maybe not everyone, but let's not go there. But why is it that some areas of science are so, I don't know, holding on to its truths with such ferocity, even though signals from the ways of making knowledge in science, the experiments, nature itself, is screaming out that we need a reevaluation. And in other ones, like the earth being the center or the sun being the center, like we don't have a good way of saying, of obviously proving that that is true without like these experiments and these thought experiments. And like, we don't appreciate the sun in the way that we appreciate a flower or a plant in front of us, right? So a certain amount of leaps of imagination have to happen for someone to say, oh yeah, the sun is the center of the solar system. And yet with something that you can smell and hold and look at that's screaming at you that our ways of knowing them is wrong, we seem somehow not to be able to reconcile with that. What do you think is up with that stickiness, Banu?
Isn't that that's the $1 million question, right?
Right.
And I think this is about institutions, right? That institutions don't give up power very easily. And it takes, I would argue, all of our efforts, which is why I'm so heartened by that so many people came to this session. I'm so heartened by all the, I mean, this was a world I did not know about until a month ago. And so I'm just so heartened by how many kindred spirits there are. And I think each of us are working in our own little worlds, and that may be coming together. You know, some change is possible, but change will not happen until we change the textbooks, you know, until that, you know, that textual knowledge changes.
I think also having the conversations, just using new words when we communicate with each other, using words that might not be new to us, but are new to the conversation. And I, you know, like you said, Banu, a month ago, this was a different concept to you. This is the different concept to me 2 months ago. You know, it just, to change how we internally think about something, we need to start using different words, try them out, try them on, see if they fit, see how they fit as we work with each other and work in our communities and with our communities. And realizing that so many people in our communities are silent because they inside have different feelings and words and languages that they would use, and they're afraid to, you know. So I think the conversations are just super important. And Kay, for bringing this topic here to this conference and into the world is amazing. And it's where you know, where I want to be now. And all of you, I'm looking at the chat just going and going and going, and you know, it's amazing. So,
but I also want to just add that I think all of you, this is what we're going to do in the second half, but all of you who actually work with plants and observe them every day are in the best place to produce new language. I remember being really struck by Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know how many of you have read that. And in that and I don't remember the term, she talks about this term, and I forget the name of the language she was talking as well, that when the, you know, the seed comes out, the little energy that it needs to come out, that there was a word for it, which English certainly doesn't have, right? But it was through observations that people come up with that terms. And similarly, you know, in Zan and I could tell you, you know, words in Indian languages that don't exist in English. But in botany, we are constrained by these English words and this English language, and that constrains what we see out in the plant world. So all of you who work with seeds and plants, and when there aren't words for it, you should make up words. I think we need more and more words in botany.
Yep. And we are going to do that today, which I'm so excited about. And I just want to add to this, you know, I've proposed non-binary botany sessions, queer botany sessions to other conferences, tried to bring this conversation before, and the resistance is there. You know, to the extent where people say, you know, to me or to the proposal, you know, identity politics have no place in science or at a conference. And, you know, that's part of why I'm so excited the way that Hannah and Banu and Zan kind of laid out the groundwork for this conversation. We are kind of forced to have to answer those questions of, you know, that colonization never ended and that we are still living in a colonized world, and particularly in botany, that these concepts, you know, don't necessarily serve us, and they certainly aren't serving plants. And I agree, Banu, that it's the people who are working directly with plants, and we'll get into this in the second half, but for me personally, I wound up having kind of a whole internal way that I think about plants and my relationship that was very like private and like my own thing, while still using these words that I was being given and using these concepts that I was being given, and, you know, being asked to teach seed saving and being like, well, I guess I have to use these words and concepts because that's the only way people will listen to me. And it took me years to get to the point where I was like, I'm going to connect my inner world and like my personal relationships with plants and start externalizing that, even though it's not canonized, even though there's no book about it, even though it's not in textbooks. And some people are going to say you're wrong, or this is the right way to think about it, or this doesn't make sense, or we don't need this, we already have all this. And so, you know, part of this conversation isn't about looking for ways to be right. It's looking for everyone to feel that there's space to share your experience of plants, whether that's culturally embedded or, you know, personal from being a queer person working with plants, or all these different ways that we bring ourselves to our work with plants. And if we can create spaces like this where we can all share that, we might start to really have this emergent dynamic process that pushes this sort of Western science botany forward and actually helps us care for plants, and each other in new ways. And so I would like to move into, because there's so much going on in the chat, so which is awesome, like people really want to talk and share, which is part of what this is about. So I want to just share one slide with you, and then we're going to move into our first breakout session. Well, our only breakout session in the middle. We'll have a group conversation at the end. So just give me a second to share this slide with you and catch up to where we're at here while the chat continues to go wild.
Yeah.
So, you know, this is a seed conference and there's a lot of seed people here. And so we've had some more general overarching theory about botany and decolonizing botany and non-binary botany. I want to bring this back to seeds for our discussion, and that will prepare us for this next section. But all of these things that we've been discussing for me are expressed through this question, what is a seed? And I just started asking people and looking online and looking for quotes of different ways that people talk about what is a seed and different ways people define it. Because again, just like we were saying about specific concepts coming out of specific time and specific culture and specific experiences, that changes the way you relate to something. So I'm going to share a few of the quotes that I found that show how we define seeds completely can change the way we treat them, the way we care for them, and the way that we see them as existing in the world. So we have, very biological definition that many of us learned in school at some point. A seed is a fertilized ovule containing the plant embryo. One of the amazing seed keepers I work with, Mary Arquette, who's a Mohawk seed keeper, shared this with me. We promise in our language that we won't abandon the seeds, that we will take care of them, because this is a duty and a responsibility that we have had since the beginning of time. Seeds are connection to spirit. Without our seeds, we will cease to be. So in the spirit of finding a diversity of voices, I found this quote from Robert Fraley, who was the CTO at Monsanto when Monsanto was still Monsanto. Seed is a technology to make farmers more productive and profitable. And then, because I knew Zahn was going to be talking about seed banking, I wanted to have a quote that I think encompasses some of what you were talking about, from Carrie Fowler, who is sort of the person the face that we put on the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. And he said, the fate of humankind is resting on these genetic resources. Seeds are a means of adaptation, which is a requirement for survival. Nothing could be more important. And then, from my friend Ira from Southern Explosion Seed Company, seeds are the stories and places that they come from. And then from Rowan White, who I hope most of you know or have heard speak or have connected with in different ways, every seed is a tiny loving prayer in action. So there are countless other ways that people can express what they think a seed is. So in this, in our breakout sessions, what I was hoping is that it's an opportunity for everyone to ask questions to each other, to dream into some of these new terms. And we've already seen that happening in the chat where people are like, well, if we don't want to use these words anymore, what words could we use? Dream into that. And then it would be amazing if when folks come back, we can start putting in the chat a few of your ways of expressing what is a seed as well. And I think that will carry us into the next section. So Anna is going to split us up into groups, and I think there'll be one panelist in each group. I don't know how many people are in here, so I don't know if it'll be more than 4 groups or not.
109.
What?
Yeah, I know.
Hey, I thought we had like 40 people.
No, okay.
Oh.
108 people. We were up to 124 at one point.
All right, so there won't be one panelist in each group because those would be really big groups, but maybe Anna will hop us around a little bit, kind of the way that corn traits tend to
I will move you around as best I can. So just a few quick things before I press the magical button and send you all on your way. I believe you have 15 minutes for this segment, if I'm correct. You will have the ability to come back out if you need to before the time is up. And if there's any technical questions you need to ask, feel free to come on out. And panelists, I have arbitrarily, I have just put you in certain groups. You are free to come back out and we can put you into another group if you want to hear the conversation. So hopefully we have been well fed with our appetizer in the first part of the segment. I'm looking forward to the main course once the breakouts are done. So please hang in there, hold on, and let's hope this works.
All right, and I think we'll have to do 10 minutes at this point for the breakout.
10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to change that right now. Okay, here we all go. And away they go. Good evening. Did you want to be put in a group?
Yes, please.
Okay. You're going to,
Anna, will you let us know when everyone's back?
I certainly will. They should be back in 17 seconds.
Awesome, thank you.
No worries. I hope that worked out okay.
How'd everyone do in there? You can test out some of your thumbs up, clapping, party symbols if you want to.
Folks can
Yeah.
use the reactions at the bottom or in your toolbar.
And Brianna, you were cut off in the middle of a sentence, and I would love for you to be able to finish that if you're comfortable.
We were talking about naming things, and it just made me think a lot how I'm constantly asked, what are you? And just this need to classify and name. Yeah, I didn't really have much more to say other than that.
Okay.
All right, should I pick up into the next section?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So we're gonna get a little personal now. And so a few of us are gonna share some more direct experience with plants and show in some ways how some of this theory applies to the way that we interact with or have relationships with different plants. And I just wanted to start with three really quick as an introduction to this idea of decolonizing, non-binary and queer, botany. So there's three plants here. The first is a pansy. The second is a lily, Victoria amazonica. And the third is a wild bush tomato, Dungawan bush tomato. So these are three different examples that relate to what we've just been talking about. But with pansies, and also things like lavender, for example, and green carnations and a few other things, there are some plants that we or have been assigned a meaning. So with pansies, for example, you know, I have a whole talk that I give just about pansies, and you know, how did pansy become a derogatory way to refer to gay men or to effeminate men? How did lavender become more of a celebratory way of talking about queerness? And so that's an assigned meaning. Something like Victoria amazonica, that middle photo, like these lilies are at botanic gardens, and they're usually like the main attraction at botanic gardens because they're massive, and you've probably seen pictures of like babies sitting on them, and you know, it's like a whole thing. And the way that the language that we have been given to talk about this particular plant is that it changes its gender. So, you know, at one point, when the flower first blooms, it's called male, and it's producing pollen, and it's attracting insects. And then it is called a floral lounge, because the plant warms up and it makes a really comfy place for the insects to stay. And then the language we're given for it is that overnight, it changes its gender to female so that the insects have stayed, picked up the pollen, and then are leaving the pollen before the insects leave the plant. So this whole idea of changing gender seems like a really inaccurate way to understand a whole being, a whole plant, and brings up that question of why are we saying it's changing its gender? Why aren't we looking at it as a whole, complete being in and of itself? And then the third one is the Dungawan bush tomato, which was fairly recently given the classifications Solanum plastifexum, because it is seen as defying our botanical understanding of sex in plants. It's not always a perfect flower, it's not always imperfect, it's not always male or female or bisexual, it's sort of everything. And so, oh, now mine won't advance either. With all of these plants, when you start doing internet searches where you're like, I'm interested in learning more and thinking about this, this is the kind of language that you see. 7 insanely weird plant species. Really weird sex in the garden. These are real titles to actual articles, truly written about plants, trying to share information about plants. Plants have adapted strange techniques to help with sex. Bizarre plants only a mother could love. Weird world, plants that keep switching sex is first to be named gender fluid. 5 sex quirks of plants, not safe for work. This is the kind of language I have been coming across for years when I'm trying to learn more and understand plants for who they are, and understand them in a more direct experience. And this is again and again about plants that don't fit into this colonized binary way that we are being taught in dominant culture and dominant textbooks and dominant educational paradigms to see plants. So if again and again and again we have to say, this is weird, this is bizarre, this is strange, this is not normal, then something's wrong with the language and concepts that we are provided with to talk about plants. So we're each going to share a story of a plant that we have a personal relationship with, and share a little bit how we are interacting with that plant and thinking about that plant. That's a little different. And this isn't to say there's one way to do it, or we're right, or everyone should do it this way. But the more diversity of experiences that we can share and listen to, the more we're going to be able to shift this dominant culture of botany. So Hannah, you want to start?
Yeah, so Kay had this idea of us sharing a special relationship that we have with a special plant. And as a botanist, or as one may conceptualize a botanist, we study plants. You don't have a relationship with them. You're the scientist looking at the plant through this lens. Throughout my life, I've never looked at plants that way. And the reason why I studied botany in college is I just wanted to stare at and look at and be with plants more. I've always just felt this connection to plants. They move me emotionally. They do everything for us. They are our environment. They're just like these amazing and magical, mysterious things. And as a scientist, we don't believe in magic, right? I mean, I do actually, but scientists aren't supposed to believe in magic or mystery. And if there's a mystery, we can come up with a theory, and we have the scientific method that we can use and accumulate data but to me, relationships with plants just are at this ethereal thing. So I chose a plant that it is really one of my most favorite plants, but I have a lot of favorite plants. And any of you in the audience that knows me knows it was probably hard for me to pick a plant I wanted to talk about. And when I put together some slides to share with you, I did deliberately include some of the language, the terms, the conceptualization of that plant as a scientist would. And I want to make sure you know that that isn't necessarily how I actually conceptualize this plant or value my relationship with this plant. But I wanted to use some of the botanical terminology and language as we go through the next few slides, just to kind of make that point. So this is Tithonia. Scientific name is Tithonia rotundifolia, which we always italicize, of course, and genus is capitalized and species is lowercase. And it is also called Mexican sunflower. Okay, we can go to the next one. Next slide.
I'm trying.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know if you heard me.
There we go.
Oh, I thought I took that slide out. So as a very young flower hippie child, I always made jewelry out of flowers, and rolling around in a field of poppies is not really a stretch for me. Our relationships are complicated. And for me, when I think about plants and I think about where they came from and how they got here, they connect me. They make me think about the journeys that they have taken and why. And they make me think about the lands where they were taken from, or the lands they came from. And they make me want to learn more, to stare more, to listen more, to think more. We'll go to the next one. So the botanical classification of Tithonia lands it in the Asteraceae family. It is joined there by 32,000 other species of plants that are considered related to Tithonia. And most of these relationships were determined by dissecting those flowers. The major characteristic of the Asteraceae is the flower, the composite flower known as a capitulum. And we'll look a little bit more deeply at that. We can go forward. There are many, many plants in the Asteraceae family. They all have these round flowers. They're all insect pollinated. And they're very, very diverse genera of family, which is another reason why I like it, because there is so much diversity. We can go on to the next one. So what we often call a flower in the Tithonia genus and in the Asteraceae family is a complex structure. In botany, we call it an inflorescence, which is an aggregate of flowers. We give it a botanical term. We call it a capitulum. I just think it's beautiful, and it takes my breath away and makes me speechless, actually, when I'm outside and looking at Tithonia plants growing. But when I have to come in and write things down, those are some of the words that are in my my arsenal to use. Next slide. So we can dissect that, and we can assign a whole number of binaries to that dissection and to that structure. In the capitulum, we have two different types of flowers, and we name them disc flower and ray flower. And some of those flowers are complete, and some of those flowers are incomplete, another binary. Some of those flowers are perfect, and some of those flowers are imperfect. And one of my favorite things to mention when we talk about perfect and imperfect, in the plant world, we have labeled perfect flowers, those flowers that are actually both male and female in and of themselves. And I love that. But it is a binary, and don't worry about this terrible drawing. I decided to use it even though I could have lifted any number of images out of textbooks or the internet. But it's messy. It's messy to try to delineate and tear apart and dissect these structures just so we can name them and look at this part and that part. We'll go on to the next one. Oh, and here, thank you, Bobby Engel. She's an amazing botanical artist, and she has a lot of work at the New York Botanic Garden, and she's done a much better job drawing out just one of those disc flowers. And the disc flowers are complete. They have all the different parts that you could imagine a flower having, and they're perfect. They are male and female together, binary upon binary upon binary. They are the site where we do want to talk about how these plants make that seed, and in and of this one little tiny flower is where pollination happens and where the seed and the fruit form. Next slide. How are these plants pollinated? Flowers produce all sorts of things to nourish and lure and attract insects to help them. And they have these beautiful relationships with insects and with the world around them. Like I said, plants are everything. They are our environment, and they provide everything that we need, and they provide in and of that provision, they provide everything they need. So next slide. I also, plants like Tithonia, but plants in general, I think it's really important to honor the entire life cycle. My first slide was a love story and a life cycle. And we think of these flowers shining in the mid-October sunlight and how beautiful and vibrant and fresh they are. And when we see them in the winter, I took these pictures yesterday, it's as beautiful and captivating and makes me as breathless as seeing it in October. Accessory structures, sterile ray flowers, fruits and seeds and fertilized ovaries. We have these beautiful seed pods, and birds will land on these throughout the winter. And as the bird is actually pecking through that seed head and getting nourishment in and of itself, it's also shaking some of these seeds to the ground. You can go to the next slide. And while this plant is actually native to Mexico and Central America, to a totally different climate than New England, imagine this plant in its home environment where these seeds actually would remain viable and would actually be able to germinate. They do not remain viable as far as I know in New England, but this is it's just beautiful how those seeds scatter to the ground, and there's enough for the birds and there's enough to keep going. And as those seeds disperse, are carried around, blown around, finally germinate and take root, and a new plant begins, that plant has completed its life cycle. Next plant. So do we really need words to have a relationship and a love and an understanding of plants? One thing that this plant does for me, I picture it here with a monarch, because the parts of Mexico and Central America where this plant, its center of origin, is also where the Eastern monarch overwinters. And this plant will provide nectar for the monarch butterflies well into October. And year after year after year, I've seen the monarchs, as they flock together and get ready to migrate south, all over Tithonia plants. And it makes me plant more. I plant entire hedges of these plants. And I think that it's amazing that this butterfly and this plant are native to the same region, but we can bring them together in another part of the world. And it just makes my imagination run wild. And so I think that's it, Ken.
Thanks, Hannah. I love Tithonia too. And of course, when I said to everyone, like, pick just one plant you want to talk about, we're all kind of like, I can think of too many. And I was thinking about a lot of the plants that are part of those articles that I was sharing, though the weird one, like bizarre, all of that. So I wanted to focus on something very familiar, and something that is in, you know, every book you pick up about learning how to save seeds. Cucurbits are in there. And to me, it's one of like the most binary plants in terms of language that we're given to talk about for everyday seed saving. And it's been an interesting process for me, because I came into being a seed saver and a seed farmer and running a seed company and all of that as an outsider in a lot of different ways. I didn't have a science background. I didn't have a botanical background, horticultural background, agricultural background. So for me, each time I was meeting a plant, I was really just meeting that plant. And I didn't have the words. I value a lot of botany because it has given me some of the concepts and words that I needed to learn in order to make sure I was producing seeds that grow true to type and high quality seeds. And so I'm not saying that like we're just throwing it all out wholesale, but I feel really grateful in many ways that I came into this without a lot of this knowledge, and had to form personal relationships first, and had that opportunity to learn from the plants. But with cucurbits, and you know, something that just still does not make sense to me, and I'm also not like totally interested in trying to make it make sense, but you look at the, you know, you look at cucurbits and then you start looking at this list: bottle gourds and burr cucumbers and watermelons and cucumbers and gherkins and melons and muskmelon and loofah. And you start to look at these plants and you're like, you know, each of these plants is a totally different relationship. Why are they all in this same category together? Is this the best way to really think about categorizing plants? Over 970 species, and you know, they're not all annuals. They're not all climbing or trailing. They're not all edible, medicinal, or some are for tools, some are inedible, some are poisonous. it's really all over the place. We can't just make generalizations about this family. And then, you know, on the ground, each time I met one of these plants, I was really learning. I was learning all over again. And even ones that are really related, like these two here, which I'm not going to give names right now because I'm kind of avoiding doing that. But these are very related, but they're also very different. And they had different cycles, and they worked with our climate here in the Northeast in different ways. And we wound up working with them in different ways, even though if we followed a seed saving book, it would be telling us that these two plants are the same, and they should be treated the same, and they get processed the same. And you know, that hasn't been my direct experience. And I think, you know, part of being that feeling of being an outsider for me, you know, 20 years ago was also coming into this agriculture world as someone who's queer, as someone who's had many different outward expressions of gender over my life. And when I first started getting sort of more involved in seeking out seed community and agriculture community, wondering like, am I going to fit in? Am I going to be welcomed into these spaces? And I think, you know, that kind of compound outsider feeling of like, I don't have the skills and knowledge that is expected of me in terms of knowing all these names and knowing taxonomy and knowing all of this. And also maybe I don't fit in terms of my sexuality and my gender expression and my sense of being non-binary. I think also gave me a little bit of a like meta consciousness of like, oh, I'm teaching seed saving and I'm saying male and female, and it does not feel right to me. And I can feel how using these words brings in all kinds of unconscious ideas and assumptions about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman as a human within this very binary culture that we live in. And whether or not we think we're using objective terms like male and female, and we're like, well, I'm compartmentalizing and I'm just using this in the botanical sense. I really don't think that there's any way for us to truly divorce ourselves from our internalized enculturated sense of masculine and feminine, male and female, and human identity around that. I don't think we can use those words and divorce ourselves from those underlying ideas. So what I wanted to do here is a little exercise with everyone. You can use the chat room. Here's a photo of a flower from one of the plants in the cucurbit giant category. So when you see this flower, what botanical descriptors do you think of immediately? Don't worry about trying to like be like, we're trying to be non-binary and I'm going to use like try really hard. Just like the ones that you've been taught, that you see in books, that you learned in school, that the person who taught you how to save seeds use. Like, what are all of those words that come to mind when you see this image of this flower? So I'm seeing, I'm just going back, female, ovaries, seed bearing, open, embryo, female, fruit, inferior flower, female squash, female, reproduction, receptive, pollinated, reproductive, pistils. All right, so these are a lot of the words that we are given, and so I've added some of them here. You can see there's some overlap here. And for each one of these words that we were taught, there is a binary for it. So no matter what we are doing, if we say female, when we look at plants, we're also thinking male. When we say fruiting, something is fruiting, we are actually also thinking that means there's something that's non-fruiting. When we call something imperfect, we're also thinking there's something that's called perfect. So this, these words evoke binary thinking and anthropocentric and heteronormative concepts, and particularly about one-to-one sexual reproduction relationships. So I want to do this exercise again. And now I'm just like dying to know from the 100 some odd people in this group, if you were to take, those binary couplets that we were just talking about, how would you express it in a gender neutral way? What are gender neutral descriptors that you could use when you see this flower in this particular state and wanted to describe it to someone? So use the chat room again. I want to see ideas. And no reason to be shy. Big flower, blooming, breathing, baby squash. Constantly rooting fruit. Whoa, fast. Potential. Seed carrier. Busted out flower. Seed holding. Next generation. Money honey. Welcoming to bees. Potential fruit. So, these terms and other ways that I'm hoping people can start to rethink their words is, what if we assume that all flowers are complete, that all plants are complete as they are, that all plants are perfect as they are? What if we question, and which we were doing earlier, like, are plants actually having sex in the way that we think of sex? And so we can start to think about, and these are, I put some other terms here that I've used or other people have used, making pollen, producing pollen, like adding poly as a head of words so that we're remembering that there's a lot more involved in this process than just one-to-one. So we can do the same with non-binary descriptors. And some of the terms that I've been playing with is about generation, transformation, facilitation. These are terms that that aren't about sex, that aren't about one-to-one relationships, that aren't about male or female. But for me, and like coming from my own experience and through my own identity, these are some of the words that I think about when I am hand pollinating squash, when I am thinking about the next generation, when I am thinking about the processes that I'm now part of, that bees are part of, that wasps are part of, that flies are part of, that wind is part of. These are some of the words. So if there's any other words that folks are thinking of, in this, like, please throw them in the chat. Polypollinators really came, someone was commenting on that. This idea that, especially with squash, if we look at a whole squash plant and back to that idea of the plant is perfect the way it is, there are male, there are female flowers on one plant. So the plant can't be male or female. Like, we have to throw out that whole concept. Also, to keep these plants healthy, the pollen producing flower and the pollen receiving flower on the same vine can't be exchanging pollen with each other. It has to be done between individuals within a larger population. So there is no one-to-one here, and they have no means, no mechanistic or physical means of exchanging pollen just one plant to another plant. They need us, they need pollinators. So there's this whole sort of polyamorous situation happening in the garden where we can't discount our role or the role of other parts of the ecosystem as essential to creating seeds for the next generation. So some of these concepts that we hold on to, just when you really are just relating to the plant and you're down there on the ground with them, just don't make sense. And so I feel like there's this whole kind of shadow that we bring in, there's all this baggage we bring in because of the way that we're enculturated. And not all of us have this. And that's part of the reason I wanted to put this panel together, is for us to realize that collectively, we have our personal relationships with plants. We have our different cultures and different ancestral experiences and realities that we come from, that we bring to our relationships with plants. And not all of them line up with Western botany. And that doesn't mean that they're not valuable, that they're not important, that they're not beautiful, and that they're not essential to not only shifting our personal relationships with plants, but actually transforming the food system. The food system is based on these concepts that we've been talking about. The way we share food and care for each other through food is based on all of these problematic concepts that we've been talking about during this. So it's one thing to start transforming that on the ground in our personal relationships, but I think, just as plants are so generous with seed production exponentially, that we can continue to share that out and out and out, we don't reflect that in our food system. We don't reflect that generosity that the plants offer us. And we're limited by these concepts that we've been given and the language that we've been given. And I really see this process as a way of freeing us from that and improving the way that we share food as well. So I'm going to leave the squash part there and pass it on to Zan.
Thank you. I think our stories really work well together. Here, I'll take you back to the Millennium Seed Bank, where I spent some time with Stacy, who was a gardener in the greenhouses and had been struggling to get some plants to grow further than a few centimeters. She struggled to get others to flower and yet others to bear fruit. These greenhouses grow out the seeds that have been thawed out from the freezer of the Millennium Seed Bank. Now, she's been working with a particular plant, and this is the plant that I want to talk about today. It doesn't have a name. It is at the moment identityless, because this particular plant from South Africa that she has been growing in pots since 2006 has not flowered because of a missing, she suspects it's because of a missing symbiotic relationship between an insect or a bird that she has not been able to recreate in her approximations. Stacy has been growing these plants out from seed because the herbarium specimen that was supplied with the seed was inadequate to provide a definitive identity for the plants. We can go to the next slide. While the morphologists who look at the physical structures of the seeds on the left-hand side, as you can see, evidenced by magnification, try to categorize the plants from whence it came in the way that we learned through Hannah's botanical explanations. On the right-hand side, a different area of science, the geneticists, are using chemical signatures to find genealogical relations between plants. Now, the geneticists and morphologists are not agreeing with each other in this particular case because Stacy does not have a complete morphological specimen, a herbarium specimen to signify this plant that has been only represented as seeds. Can go to the next slide. So these plants have been growing from seed in the greenhouse. And when or if flowers and fruit emerge, they will be dried and the complete sheet will be used to identify the plant. Now, Darwin was also really interested in how orchids and wasps related to each other in their reproductive cycles. And he devised these experiments where he would basically glue orchids onto the tip of pencils and other things, glue wasps, and then sort of prod orchid reproductive organs to try and simulate the kind of things that would happen out there out there. Now, Stacy has been nearly 200 years later, Stacy has been also fashioning these tools. And I'm sure those of you who are involved in breeding have also devised and innovated different kinds of tools to create these interspecies interactions, to understand what could be holding these plants in sexual dormancy. Having tinkered and prodded and nudged the plants in as many ways as she can muster, she is resigned to the idea that she does not have ultimate control over their reproductive desires. While frustrated at their stubbornness, she turns to me and asks, why should we expect these plants to thrive without their ecological companions? Stacy's frustration with being unable to force the plants to flower in the greenhouse at the bank is a reminder of the patchy understanding of this ecologies of reproduction that the plants are doing. This invisible labor of plant reproduction evades capture by the standardizing forces of science. Now, the seed bank is struggling with these kinds of problems. It's by no means the norm, but the fact that she's not able to coax this plant into producing flowers or fruits means that the identity of the seed collection will remain unknown. If the seeds of these plants are saved in the bank, what value could they have if they don't have a name or the ability to grow to full maturity and reproduce? This is one of the problems with not maintaining a relationship of a seed collection to the people for whom it has been a part of their everyday life, who have names and their own relations that are building, loving connections to the plants as well as the ecology from when they've come. I gain a lot of I gain power and empowerment from when I see these resistant plants, because I see them as, it's sad for Stacy, I feel her pain, but I also recognize that these seeds who are so far away from South Africa are kind of enacting a kind of resistance, a resistance to their cooptation, a resistance to their alienation from their home, and a resistance from being commodified in this particular iteration of seed bank world. I, do hope that these kinds of issues are not rife in the seed bank world, but it is a little reminder about how patchy and limited our knowledge is, and how maintaining those connections that each of you have with the plants that you're growing and saving and relating to is really crucial to keeping the science in step with the knowledge and the care and the love that people feel for plants and animals. So I think it works really well in the examples that have been told so far, because it's a kind of a worst case scenario of an alienated world of the remnants of colonialism. And I'm hoping that we don't end up with these kinds of orphaned plants in our seed collections. Thank you.
So I know we've gone over our time. I appreciate those of you who've hung in there, and also if you needed to go or you need to go because it's after 8, please don't hang on if you need to run. I think and I'm not sure where you're at, but I don't think we have time for our discussion at the end, because I don't want to keep people too late. So I would like to share some resources where this conversation can continue, because this is just, you know, one step, one moment in this. We weren't here to answer every question or to reinvent botany in 2 hours, and you are all part of this. So for post-conference, there is an Instagram, non-binary botany, where I will be going through what was shared in this session and sharing some of it out in posts through that account. So if you would like to follow there and participate in the comments there, so we can continue the conversation. The seed words activity with thinking about how we define seeds is on the seedshed.org website, and I shared that in the chat. And if you post there, it'll actually start posting what you say on the website. So everyone will get to see different things. And I just wanted to give Hannah and Zahn and Banu an opportunity to say if you'd like to be connected with them or follow up with them or find out more about what they're doing, how to be in touch.
Yes, please. I encourage anyone who's interested to be in touch with me to reach out. Please do.
Ditto.
And me as well. And thank you all for jumping in and being present and engaging. The chat has been amazing. I've been having so much fun watching everyone talk about this. So lots of great conversations to keep having with all of you. I know someone expressed wanting to share poetry, and I encouraged them to go to the Northeast Seed Savers meetup tomorrow night. But there's so much more that we can be expressing and sharing with each other. So that's it for me.
All right, thanks everyone. Thank you so much, Hannah and Banu and Zahn and everyone who came.
And UK.
Yeah, thank you, Kay, for bringing us all together.
And Anna for making it all
Yes,
work.
Anna.
Yes.
Well, it's definitely my pleasure. And like I said, we were well fed tonight. I know I was. I learned a great deal. And I appreciate the sharing and the information and the learning. And I just hope we take this with us into the conference. What a beautiful way to start a wonderful conference. So big thank you to all of our panelists. I put in the chat the link for the free sessions. Please tell a friend. Don't forget the needs assessment and join us tomorrow for another chock-full day of wonderful, wonderful workshops. And we look forward to seeing you for the next 8 days. You all have a wonderful evening. Be well.
Uh-oh.